Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really excited for today's conversation because, as I teased in last week's podcast, I have Ryan Gibson here, who is the founder of Content Lift, which is an agency that's focused on helping B2B marketers succeed with customer research. And as a demand gen marketer, we all know how important customer research is in order to prove the effectiveness for a lot of our campaigns. So, Ryan, I'm really excited for today's conversation. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm always excited to talk about this. So thanks for letting me blab on about it.
Yeah, no, I will like take up anything that comes out of your mouth and cherish forever. Like honestly, I nerd out over all of your content on LinkedIn, to be honest.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. And the purpose of today's conversation, which one of the things that you have on your website messaging is, and if you're a demand gen marketer active on LinkedIn, you'll see this plastered all over LinkedIn, where everybody's like, oh, you need to talk to your customers. You just need to talk to your customers. People say just go talk to your customers, but nobody really shows you how. And that's one of the
Yeah.
things that I love about your angle on LinkedIn is you are bringing that tactical insight on how and the questions to ask and what not to ask. So I really wanted to take today's conversation to dive into one, the importance of customer research for demand gen marketers specifically, and then tactical tips for demand gen and B2B marketers too, so that they can succeed on their day to day with customer research and demand gen programs, and eventually ask you for their expert advice and work with you.
I hope so. I'm trying to do what I can. I don't know. Some days I feel like I'm just yelling into the void, but
Right?
that's nice to hear that, right? So hopefully I'm making a difference somehow.
I think you are. I think don't sell yourself short. Do you want to go ahead and get started with your background? One of the things that is just such an interesting angle to me is the focus on customer research, because I don't actually know that many people who all that they do is customer research.
Yeah.
So do you want to like, how'd you get started in this? Why is it your passion? And, what is it that Content Lift helps marketers do today?
I'll start with how I got into it, and then I'll talk about like why I think it's important. Um, how I got into it. God, I don't think we can go through 20 years of my background in this time frame, but in short, I started actually in B2C, B2B environment. I worked in hospitality, and I worked for a franchise chain, and my job was like to sell the franchises to business owners. But the research side fell on my shoulders. And for people who aren't familiar with B2C, which is they heavily bias themselves into research. Like it is a big thing in that world. Um, the budgets for it, especially 20 years ago, were astronomical. And we could not afford that. We were a scrappy little chain up in Canada. So I just went and did it myself. I went and did all the work, observational work. So like watching people, how they move through the store, going and talking to them. I'd go into the stores of my competitors, pretend I was a customer, start talking to the customers and ask them why they're buying from here. And people thought I was out of my mind. But I just needed to understand how and why they chose them over us. And that actually informed how we grew a lot of the chain, how we positioned, how we branded, and what our strengths were, what do we lean into. So I carried a lot of that throughout my career. I had hit a bit of a wall in my 30s, sort of burned out of hospitality. And I was like, oh, what do I do now? I went back to school, took broadcasting, and then I became a reporter for 3 years, an investigative TV and radio reporter. And that's what really solidified my skill set. And that was fun. I really enjoyed that, but it was not my calling. So I was like, I think I'll go back to marketing. So I did that, went the PR route, and then but I couldn't, because that's what a lot of reporters do. They become PR people. But I couldn't stay in the box. I just kept getting in the way of like strategy and business development, and like I couldn't help myself. So I just went back into that, and I've been doing it ever since. So it's been my foundation of like how I approach marketing. And then I just niched it 2 years ago because people started asking me to do it because they knew it was part of what I used to do. And when I started doing it again, because I had sort of gotten away from it, I was trying to be a fractional. I was like, oh, I forgot how much I love this. This is great. So I just niched into it. So that's sort of how I got into it. Why do I do it? I was thinking about this a lot, Janelle, like in the last day or two. And the short answer is because you're going to lose.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't understand, you will lose in B2B. And that's a real hyperbolic statement, right? So, but I believe that to my core. because let me unpack the three ways that I think we talk about it. So from a marketing perspective, if you don't understand how and why people are making decisions within their business, you cannot influence those decisions effectively and efficiently and in a relevant manner. That's the first one. You had Sam Jacobs on, I think, the other day, right?
Yeah, I had him on I think a few months ago, and I'm still dripping out some of the social
Okay,
content.
that's what it was. So he's great, and he said something really interesting. It is not hard to turn meetings into revenue, and he's right. So marketing needs to, when they're talking to sales, marketing needs to understand your job is to understand where you start, where you end, and where sales starts and where they end, and where you overlap.
Mm-hmm.
That's the other part, because the journey is not just a marketing journey and not just a
Yep.
sales journey. It is a holistic journey. And without research, you're not going to understand that part, and you won't get that alignment that we always all love to talk about. The last thing I like to think of is like from the executive side. A business is just a bet in a market. It is a trade-off of choices of capital and money. It is the best way to de-risk that you're going to get it wrong, right? Because that's what executives care about. Are we spending money here effectively? Research helps with all three of those things. So that's like the long answer of why I do it, because it helps address all those parts of the business. Sorry, that
I
was like a
love
big
that.
one, a big answer, but that's how I think about it.
Yeah, and it's really critical that people understand that too, because a lot of companies right now, they just like, oh yeah, maybe one day, or they're like, yeah, we know we
Yeah,
need to, but we need to focus on all these other things first. With your background of specifically being in the weeds, asking people about customer research, why do
yeah.
you think so many companies just like shrug their shoulders about it?
There's a lot of reasons. It's a spectrum of things, right? You probably hear the same thing about demand gen, like why they don't do it. There's lots of reasons. Let me tell you what sort of floats up the most. First is politics,
Mm-hmm.
right? We know the customer, we know what they want. And that's driven by all sorts of things. Product thinks they know what customers best want. Salespeople think they know what they best want. Founders have high opinions and executives, and marketers too. And the funny part is, all of them are right to an extent, but what they see is one piece of the puzzle that they're focused on. So their bias goes towards that. So the politics gets in the way of that, because people say, no, no, we don't need to do that. We don't need to spend money and time on that. We know the customer. Gatekeeping is sometimes a big thing. Salespeople, and I understand why they get concerned when we say, can we talk to your accounts? What do you want to talk to them about?
Right.
Why are you talking to them? Is this going to impact our deal? Are they going to leave us? Like, what does marketing want to talk? Like, it's just this weird sort of
I've been there
vibe.
firsthand. I know exactly what you're
Yeah.
talking about.
And I get the concern, because I've worked with sales. I've been a salesperson. I sort of get it. But that goes back to what I talked about, that alignment. How do I get you more meetings? How do I get you more people like this person? I need to understand what they're doing before they come to us. What's happening in their business? How do they make decisions? Because salespeople will get an inkling of that, but they don't get the whole thing.
Mm.
That's another reason. Another reason is people aren't good at it. They're bad at it. They struggle with it. They don't know how to action the insights, which is a big one. Sometimes it just sits on a shelf. Like a lot of the things we do as consultants, so people, or as big projects, they sit on a Google Drive somewhere and they just are lost to time. So they don't know how to actually move with those things and like put them into the market and get feedback on them. So there's lots of reasons why people don't do it. And sometimes they just don't, to your point, like they just don't think that they have to. The
Do you
product will
think,
sell itself.
yeah, do you think that there's a certain point where you should start with research kind of like internally at no cost? And do you think there's a point where you should actually invest, like in someone like you that goes out and charges a hefty dollar, but for good reason, and then
Yeah, good
delivers those
question.
actionable insights? Like at what point, like how would someone get started?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think there's anything wrong in the beginning about going to your subject matter experts, going to sales, going to product. It's actually really still a helpful way to get started.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if you have the trade-offs of time, right? So if you say you walk in as a marketer day one, demand gen person day one, You haven't, there's nothing. Well, it's going to be hard actually to understand what you should be talking to customers about until you sort of get the landscape from your colleagues, right? So from sales and product, like why do we exist in the first place? Like why are we selling this thing? What does an average deal look like? What are the features people care about the most? Because then you actually have sort of a foundation for then testing those hypotheses in market, right? So I actually like to start there, not for the work I do. I work with
Mhm.
companies that have product market fit. They have initial intelligence. What they want is an audit, or they're missing a lot, right? Or they've done that work of talking to colleagues. Now they need to go a step further.
Mhm.
But starting there is a good point. I think once you get there, though, the next step is outward looking into either customers or in-market buyers, because they both can offer different things when you interview them.
True. Yeah, good point. Do you think there's ever a point where, you talked about when a marketer's first joining and what you should do is get like a lay of the land.
Mhm.
I don't think that a marketer should just stop there once they've gotten the lay of the land. Like, what do you think
No,
what's your recommendation for the ongoing research and the ongoing knowledge development?
yeah. Well, research is broken down into two parts, right? So there's qualitative and quantitative.
Mhm.
I focus on qualitative, which is all the sort of subjective-y, hot take stuff is sometimes what I call it. It's still a scientific, there's still like a rigor to it and a scientific approach, but it is, there's nuances in how people talk about things. Quantitative surveys, dashboards,
Mhm.
whatever, right? Both are important,
Mhm.
because a demand gen person needs to understand both, right?
Mhm.
Why are people coming in, and then what's happening when they come in, right? So with quantitative conversion rates, are we getting the traffic we want? Are we hitting our KPIs and OKRs, so on? Uh, but I like qualitative, and I think people should do that too, because that rounds out, why that stuff's happening in the first place. So tell me if I'm not answering the question, but I think you should be doing both. It's just a matter of like how much effort do you want to put in, right? And I think it's what we've done over the last few years, and I'm not alone in thinking this, is we've swung the pendulum so far into the digital side, and all like it's just data overload. It doesn't really tell you anything, right? Like you just sort of get lost in a sea of numbers and spreadsheets, and you're paralyzed. Whereas if you can balance, why people are coming to you, and then what happens when they come to you, that is a good way to start. It's just a matter of like how deep do you want to go into those things.
Mhm.
Did I answer the question, or did I get it wrong?
I think that you provided a good answer as like a
Okay.
part two, but let me rephrase it a
Okay.
different way because I do want to get your opinion on that. How often should
Mm,
marketers seek and continue getting
got
that
it.
research? Once a month, three times a month, only once a year,
Yeah.
once a quarter?
There's people debate that, right? And there's new tools now that can help you do it faster. So
Mhm.
one of the things we see in the research community, I'm seeing it now, is like agile research. And it's sort of self-evident what that means. How can you get insights more quicker? I think once a year is a really good for a deep dive, right? An audit, checking the DNA. Are we still right? Because markets are not static.
Mhm.
Things move and change all the time, right? A good way to think of it is, we're using Zoom for this. What was the total addressable market of Zoom before the pandemic? What is it now? How are people using it now compared to before, right? And that's just within a 2-year time frame. There's new competitors. There's so many offshoots now of video chat. So, you know, under trying to continually understand, how you're providing value in the market and why people are choosing you, and are there reasons they're leaving you now? That's key. I think that's once a year though. But for like feedback in the market, you can use things like in a more agile basis. You can schedule quick interviews with people. You can use tools like Winter is one that people I
Mhm.
really like, where it's like, you're testing your messaging and so on. For that stuff, once a quarter I think is pretty good for me. But that I think once a year for like a really good deep dive.
I love that answer because my brain immediately goes to what's the split and if does it even matter between startups needing research
Yeah.
and large established enterprises? Because
Oh. They both do. It depends. It's just different, right? I think with startups, a lot of the time is they haven't built out a real full go-to-market strategy, right? Especially because they're founder-led. Usually the founders are
Mhm.
technically driven or they have a technical domain of expertise. So they're just sort of product obsessed, which is fine. That's good. They should be. But now you need to build out a whole strategy. And I'll give you an example. I worked with a company out of Israel. They were like an AI fintech play. They brought on a VP of marketing because they just raised a significant Series A, and the VP was had to build out the team. They were a product marketer by trade, so they were used to doing research, but they had no time because as an executive now in that first 90 days, they had too many other things to do. So they brought me in to speed up the process because they
Mm.
had nothing. They also actually had a hypothesis that was wrong because I went and tested their hypothesis of who their ideal customer was, and the founders were off. So they would have invested
Mhm.
probably a big chunk of that meaty tens of millions. Well, not that much, but you know what I mean? Like that, they just got that Series A, probably going to dump a couple million in the next year. They might have wasted a lot of money. So that's from that perspective as a startup. I think that's when you do it. When you get to a more like established company, it's interesting because then it starts to fracture out, right? And we could talk a bit about that. But there's different parts of the business that need research, and different disciplines start to do it on their own accord. So you might have like a user UX person. You might have customer success doing churn audits. You might have sales win close lost audits. What I do, which is buyer discovery. You might have like buying committee ABM type interviews, right? So it's not so much that they shouldn't not be doing it or what does it look like, or actually what is what it looks like. It starts to fracture into different parts of research.
Yeah.
I hope that answered the question, but it just grows and expands, I guess, as a company gets bigger.
Yeah, and for startups, it's really important to your point, the example that you gave, to know where you're putting your dollars into and
Yeah,
making sure that that's right on track. When you get larger, more to enterprises, it's making sure that your product enhancements and your developments are continuously meeting the needs of your
yeah.
customers. Because what another thing you pointed out is that that's always evolving too, the market and your customers' needs.
Another way to maybe explain it is, as a startup, you just need market share. Like you need to get in, you need
Yeah,
to get revenue, and you need to get cash in the door.
yeah.
Coffers need to get filled, right? Whereas when you get to a certain, if you look at your financials and you're like, okay, you know what, our cash outlay for the next 3 years is positive. We're actually not going to run out of money in the next 5 years unless everything goes AWOL. We're probably pretty good. So now it's time to like build
Mhm.
moats. To your point, like more product improvements, better design, right? It just gets different as you get bigger.
Mhm. One of the things that you talked about just now was how you focus on buyer discovery. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
curious, just on my own insight of marketers and sales reps and customer success, who do you work most closely with? Marketers or sales or executive leaders? Like when somebody's looking for buyer discovery.
All of them. Um,
Good.
it just depends who sees the pain,
Okay.
right? Because not everyone acknowledges it or sees it based on their experience. I think, from my read of it, it's people who are really closest to like a business development mindset, to use like a really old school term.
Mhm.
Because business development is actually the word I would have used for marketing 20 years ago,
Mhm.
right? It's not seen that way sometimes in B2B, but it's people often will, if what an executive, a salesperson, a marketer just say, we are missing intelligence to be more effective in the market and spend our capital wisely. And usually the catalyst is like more specific to their domain. So sales, like, I need more meetings. Marketing is like, I need more stuff in the pipeline. Executives, I want more revenue. So, but what they really care about is moving the needle for the business, right? So I get reached out to by all of them. But the conversations are identical. They'll say, we just don't feel like we know enough about our customers to move the business forward.
I love that. I love that it's multi departments and it's
It
not
is.
just, marketing is the only one that cares about it or executives are the only one that cares about it. So that's really encouraging for myself, right? But then also for the industry as a whole, that people are starting to really get interested and understand the importance of research. And I think that's really critical. I've had my own journey where I first joined a client and I was asking all these questions. I'm like, I just don't get what we help with. And they're like, oh, well, it's this and that. I'm like, I don't get it though. And I finally was able to talk to a customer and I was like, wow, like just from a marketer perspective. And I was like, we're not using that, guys. Like this makes sense. And it's good because, as a consultant, you're a third party. You're coming in, fresh eyes, fresh meat, you're
Yeah.
able to ask and kind of poke and pry a little bit more. And then somebody internally where, they're stuck either in the politics or they've just been in the weeds for too long that they struggle with kind of like that bird's eye view. But being able to come in and and just as a consultant and much less providing value for my client as well, of just saying, listen, like we're a little bit off, and that was just on one customer interview. Like it wasn't even this full big project or nothing. I just needed personally to better understand, just so my demand gen campaigns that I did for them would resonate, right? Because that was the problem they were having, is that
Yeah.
nothing was working. So I thought that was really, really cool and encouraging that it's throughout multiple departments.
I see it all, to your point, like of not knowing, we're not using that. I see it all the time.
Yeah.
I haven't done a project yet where there hasn't been some type of like wow moment, right?
Mm.
Or some type of new learning. Now, a lot of times it's not like seismic shifts. It's actually sort of incremental change, or sometimes they're actually, I often get the converted, right? So I get people who really care about research. So by proxy, they actually probably have a good understanding of their customer by what they've done by hook and crook. So they'll actually recognize a lot of the things that they believe to be true, but then they'll also get, oh, we didn't know that,
Mm.
right? And it's all the work I do, which is very much voice of the customer work. And just so to explain that for people, it's using the words of customers directly to inform your decisions about what you're going to do next. And I take an aggregate of that and I sort of synthesize it. But when you get that voice of the customer work and you see the words they're using to
Mm-hmm.
describe the value you're bringing, why they chose you, what made them trust you, why they choose you over all the other options they could choose, it starts to become really powerful for not just like your marketing, but for actually influencing the culture inside the organization about what's really happening in market. It's really powerful.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's really critical for companies to provide that lens for all go-to-market teams. I see a lot of that more on like product marketers docs where they're talking
Yeah.
about how to align the product with what marketing should actually talk about. And that's
Yeah.
like music to my ears. If I am working with a client, they're like, here's all the document on the research and how we need to position it. I'm like, yes. I'm like, y'all get it. I'm like, yes, this makes my life so much
Great.
easier. So that's really, really awesome. I do have one more question,
Yeah.
actually potentially two, just
Sure.
directly from my listeners. With my listeners being predominantly marketing and demand gen marketers, not a lot of them can go and say, "Hey, we need to pay really big dollars and go get research done."
Yeah.
What are
Yep.
some tactical tips that my listeners can take away from today to still get some customer insights and do some of that research on their ends that they can implement into their own demand gen campaigns?
So are we believing that they have access to customers or making that assumption?
Yeah, let's make that assumption so
Okay.
that we can actually get them what they need of
Yeah.
like where to start, what questions to ask.
Yeah. Because I get that too, and I get a whole
Yeah.
thing where I can help with people. That
Yeah.
could be another podcast.
We'll have you back.
So yeah, so you have access to customers. Perfect. So the first one is figure out who you want to talk to. Not all customers are alike, and not all customers will give you the insights you need. Really easy example: someone who just churned is not going to be the same as someone who just installed, or just it was just a closed one count 3 months ago. They are going to offer very different insights. Or another way to look at it is, if you're trying to inform your go-to-market strategy, do buyer discovery, I'd rather talk to someone who just closed or someone who's been our customer for 5 years, because the person who's now the account contact might not even be the person who was there for the purchasing decision.
Mhm.
So they might have no knowledge. So you got to figure out who you want to talk to. You got to figure out like what you want to talk about. So again, are we talking about that marketing motion, sales motion, product, right? Those are some quick things I think you want to talk about. Um, Definitely treat it like cold outreach. So what I mean by that is this is the getting people to talk to you is the longest part of the process.
True.
Always is. They're busy, right? They got other things. They might even love your product. They might be like your
Mhm.
top super fan. They have other things they're doing, right? At their job, their life, and them doing you a solid is not high on their priority list, right? So you have to be patient, reach out to them multiple times, really frame that this is just a research conversation, not trying to sell you anything, incentivize them if you want to. People debate that. I'm actually all for it. I think it actually it gets things done faster. And it's just a nice way to sort of give something to your client.
Say
Or if
thank
you don't
you.
want, yeah, if you don't want to do that, send them a gift after the fact.
Yeah.
That just that's an old tried and true in marketing, right?
Yeah.
And then the last one I was going to say is don't. I'm sure you can appreciate this. Don't like list out 1,800 questions. Just like topics of discussion.
Yeah.
Because what happens is, and I did this when I was a reporter, one of the first mistakes I ever made. You have this like laundry list of questions, and you're really excited about them. You're like, these are bangers. Like these are gonna get all the goods. And then what happens is you get so focused on the questions and not worried about missing something, you stop actively listening. The brain shuts off to hearing what Janelle is talking about versus I'm focused on the questions. And I did this once. I was interviewing a politician. I was going through my list of questions. I had the microphone in front of them and I was looking at my list and not listening to what they said. And when I got back to the newsroom, they had said something so like juicy, and I missed the opportunity to like follow up on it
Mm.
because I wasn't listening. I was so focused on the questions. Now that's sort of like a very hyper niche thing in interviewing, but I tell people that because active listening is actually the hardest part of interviews. So if
It's
you
true.
just, yeah, I'm sure it took you sort of a bit to sort of find your way in that, right? So just list out some topics that you really think are important to discuss and just start there.
Yeah, I love that active listening. And I like try to do that on my podcast too. Like even today, I'm like looking at my notes. I'm like, what's the framework of what I want to ask Ryan?
Yeah.
But also, it's like I do need to actively listen because it's a native conversation. It's organic, right? Like we're actually live recording this. So being able
Yeah.
to, dig deeper on some of the key concepts that you're like knowledge dropping right now, it's absolutely critical for the listeners to further expand on that. And if there's
Yeah.
anything that we don't expand on, anybody, please reach out to him directly. We'll get his contact information at the end of this. But there's one more question that I want to ask for you
Yeah.
today,
Yeah.
Ryan, before we close up. What is the number one mistake that you see that marketers make when they're doing customer research that my listeners can avoid? And that might be the active listening one, but is there anything else that, is just a big do not do, or you're totally going to just ruin the initiative?
Objective. Why are you talking to them in the first place? And make sure that when you're talking, like the objectives you have or the topics of discussion, tie back to the marketing activities you're trying to get better at
Mhm.
in your go to market strategy. So let's say we don't know enough about how their business model works. Focus on that. Because if we know how their business model works, we can have better content ideas, at that awareness, top of the funnel, whatever word you want to use, where they just figure out you exist. They find out you're there. How are you going to be relevant to them? Well, you're relevant to them by understanding how their business works. Maybe you want to understand what communities they're in and how they make decisions, how they evaluate marketing. One of the things I like to ask in a marketing discovery is like, what do you think is a lie? Stuff like that. And it just throws people off. They're like, oh, that's good. I'll tell you what I think is nonsense. And it's like, then like, don't use that in my marketing.
Yeah.
Like, how do you build a short list? So it's like, really be specific about what you want to understand. Because I've seen product marketers who often get tasked with this work inside an organization to inform demand gen people. they'll have a conversation just like we're having, hit record. Hey, how's it going? And it's great. They're trying to establish some rapport, and they just talk about all sorts of things that have no relevance to what they're trying to accomplish. And I've seen them come back. They're like, I just talked to a customer for an hour. I'm like, yes, amazing. Here's the 4 sentences I took away from that. I'm like, oh my God, I'm not going to do anything. So, but it's just because they were new to it, right? They didn't understand. They thought they're going to retain all the information.
Yeah.
You won't record everything because you won't remember everything.
True.
But I would say make sure that you are using every minute you talk to them wisely. So have an objective and really focus the discussion. But to your point, keep it not so boxed in that there's not room for, some new things to learn.
Okay, so I said that was the last question, but just based on what you said, I have one more, please. One
Yeah,
more.
throw it at me.
If we're focusing based on objective,
Yeah.
is there ever a conversation if I get 1 hour with a customer that we could cover multiple objectives? Do I
Yep.
ask multiple objectives with different customers? Do I come back? Because time is precious. So do I have one
Yeah.
conversation on one objective, another conversation on another objective? What's your recommendation for one, streamlining the process, but then also if you're just starting out, like for my startups, they don't know what they don't know. Messaging
Yeah.
customers, why somebody would even buy from them. They need all like a laundry list of objectives. What's
Yeah.
your feedback?
I say start with what's most important to know, right? If the most important thing to know is, okay, we need to know why they're buying from us. Just start there, and you can just have that one thing, right? And if that takes up half an hour, 45 minutes, then yeah, come back to them, right? Spend the time on what's most vital, because every minute counts, because people take time to remember things. You'll see this in interviews. You probably see this, right? After about 5-10 minutes, they start to go, oh, you know what? I just remembered this. Their brain takes time to sort of warm up and get going and make connections and understand your questions and what you're trying to get out of them, right? And maybe they answer wrong. So there's all these things that happen in the context of an interview that take a bit of time. So keep it simple for your first few. And I will say one more tip: make sure it's consistent. If you are selling into, don't interview a marketing manager or an IT person at an SMB versus an IT person in a Fortune 5,000. They're going to be very different people with very different problems, right?
Great call
So
out.
keep those sample sizes, to use a researcher term, as close to apples as you can, because then you'll have less interviews. You won't have to have as many. You'll actually be able to get away with fewer.
Great point. Wow. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness. I've loved this conversation and I love following you on LinkedIn. So I was really
Thank you.
excited that I was able to snag you as a guest on my podcast. Where
Thank you.
can, yeah, go ahead.
No, it's just thank you. It's nice just people want to talk about this because, like I said, I feel like sometimes I'm yelling into the void. So
Yeah,
yeah.
honestly, like truthfully, I want to have more conversations around research, particularly when it comes to why the importance for demand gen campaigns. And
Yeah.
I'm starting to see a lot more, like I'm starting to see the light, if you will, on being
Yeah.
able to see the end result of like where we started by doing the research and deploying the campaigns, like a before and after. And it's just I'm fangirling over all of this, and I'm loving
Perfect.
it.
Awesome.
Where can people find you? I know you're active on LinkedIn, but if they want to learn more about you,
Yeah.
how can they get in touch?
Well, that's the best place to start. And then I have a website, contentlift.io, right? Where I walk through. I had this one thing, I call it my one case study. And I say that because it's a bit of a lark on like case studies where sales always wants another case study.
LOL.
I know, and I get why. But I sort of a tongue in cheek thing. But it's a great way for people to it's a peek behind the curtain of like how I go about this, right? From start to finish. And it actually shows with a software company with where I am in Ottawa, how we use research to actually move the needle. And little small things, right? That like I said, it's never transformational leaps. It's often just sort of, changes and shifts here and there. And those shifts can make such an impact. So they can go to contentlift.io, they can look at my one case study, or just reach out LinkedIn. I answer all my DMs, because people have a lot of questions around this, and I really want to help people get better at this. So because I think it's so vital.
And you created your own course too, kind of teaching
Yeah.
people how to do it themselves too. You want to talk more about that?
Yeah. I was just trying to away from like, total solicitation. But yeah, I have my DIY guide. It really just so it's a breakdown of how I approach this. All my templates, all my guides. I tried to price it pretty reasonable. It's like $105 because for most of the people who approach this work, who sort of touched on, they've never done it before.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's complicated. It's like anything else. It's just a process. So I think it really helps people sort of like get their feet wet, get in the door, and you can read some of the testimonials from people. But even if they have questions about that, happy to answer people.
I love that. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I always love talking about this.